Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK. As ever, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's recording, which I'm absolutely certain that you will. Now, my guest today is James Esses. He's a psychotherapist in training who is working towards a master's in Integrative Psychotherapy. Now, James sees regular clients for long-term psychotherapy, and crucially for our discussion today, at least in my view, he's selflessly volunteered as a counsellor. He's provided weekly counselling to children and young people. That's why I'm so keen to actually speak to him today, in a week in which the Equalities Minister, Truss MP, has said that she's pressing ahead with the government's commitment to ban conversion therapy in order to protect LGBT people from these abhorrent practices. They're her words. There's a real concern that this would prohibit evidence-based therapy for children experiencing gender dysphoria, cases of which have exploded over the past decade or so. A petition has been created by and advocated by healthcare professionals calling on the government not to criminalise therapy for vulnerable children. Now, studies, the petition argues, show that children who reckon they're trans will come to identify as the sex they were actually born as. There's been a worrying trend with whistleblower reports from certain NHS trusts exposing practices in which children are placed on generally irreversible puberty blockers and treatments, later regretting doing so. Kira Bell being the most notable but far from isolated case. The petition says that children with gender dysphoria don't fit a one-size model and need access to a range of therapeutic options, which criminalising therapy actually removes. But anyway, that's enough from me. James, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi Darren, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Now, James, why the petition? Why have you advocated that people sign this petition?
Sure. And I think it's important to say just from the outset that the practice of conversion, where someone's aim is to change another's sexuality or gender, is abhorrent. And thankfully, most of its practices have been illegal for some time. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. But myself and a significant number of my therapeutic colleagues are concerned about the conflation of the term conversion therapy with beneficial explorative therapy for those with gender dysphoria. And our concern is that there's been calls from a number of activist groups who are seemingly asking for all therapy for gender dysphoria to be banned unless it affirms transitioning as the only way forward. And we are concerned that this will damage our profession, but most importantly will damage the clients that we are seeking to serve.
Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, surely safeguarding for children and adolescents has to be the biggest priority for any healthcare professional. And I wonder then, what do you actually mean by safeguarding therapy? And currently, is the practice such that I've seen whistleblower reports argue this, that actually children in as little as 2 sessions of meeting someone to try and diagnose them for gender dysphoria, and as little as 2 sessions can end up being placed on these, what can be, or arguably could be, generally irreversible treatments. What is the current practice, and why do you think actually safeguarding therapy is really, really crucial here?
Well, you're completely right, Darren, in terms of the responsibilities of healthcare professionals. I mean, if we're all going to abide by the Hippocratic Oath, the mantra there is to first do no harm. And actually, with this significant increase in those detransitioning, and obviously you mentioned Kira Bell at the start, we have to stop and consider, well, actually, if people are going down this pathway of transitioning without the proper therapeutic exploration, is that in some cases causing significant harm to people? Our concern is that if we look to other countries where similar legislation has gone through or is in the process of going through, Canada with Bill C6, for example, and I've recently seen a bill in the Republic of Ireland that is looking to be put through. The wording is so broad, so ambiguous, that from speaking with a number of my colleagues, there was a real fear that if legislation went through in the UK, therapists would be too scared to see clients with gender dysphoria for fear of being accused of some sort of wrongdoing and potentially ending up in prison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's horrific, isn't it? That's terrifying. But what can the bill, given that this is happening, the Equalities Minister has said this is happening. We've got that in writing. She wrote that letter I believe in response to closing down this Equalities group, which strikes me as being nothing more than putting activists onto a panel and calling it LGBT plus whatever, and strikes me as just more reasons to push victim narratives and all the rest of it. But putting that to one side, James, I don't want to get you drawn into my views on politics. Putting that to one side,
yeah,
the problem here is that the bill as it stands would actually mean that these therapies could be criminalised. What can be done to ensure that that doesn't happen? Does there have to be some clause in the bill? What needs to happen here?
Yes, I mean, there's a number of ways that it could be done. And as I said at the beginning, myself and my colleagues are all for banning conversion therapy when it comes to people going out of their way to try and force someone else to change, like I said, the sexuality or the gender identity. But what we would look for in any legislation were particular safeguards. So that could be some exemptions under the legislation, which allows for, as I've said, normal explorative therapy to take place when people are having these questions about their gender, because we owe it to our clients to consider this properly. I mean, the most fundamental thing to note, and I think it's really important that people appreciate this, and this is in relation to children. Most children, the vast majority actually, who experience gender dysphoria will eventually come to settle into their biological sex. And it's not really surprising when we think about the significant social, neuropsychological changes that teenagers go through. And therapy or counselling can be very effective in assisting young people through this process in the same way that we would use therapy for any client who presents with distressing or anxiety-provoking thoughts or feelings. Explorative therapy enables us to consider underlying causes, for example. Studies have demonstrated links between gender dysphoria and internalized homophobia, past traumatic experiences, and actually in more recent times, quite a few studies have shown quite a significant link between gender dysphoria and those with autism spectrum disorder. So again, it's about taking everything holistically and exploring it thoroughly with clients before they make potentially irreversible changes to their lives.
That's one thing that struck me. I remember this line there was a BBC Newsnight report into the one NHS Trust, and it basically said that there were some clients who would come in, or parents of clients would come in and say, well, I prefer a trans outcome over a gay outcome, which just is vehement homophobia. And so my concern is that actually we're going down a path of which would be comfortable in a state like Iran, almost, in some cases. Now, I don't think for a second that these are every single case of a child or adolescent experiencing gender dysphoria is because of homophobia. But even one or two is too many in my eyes. And I just think, to what extent do you think that the current pathways towards transitioning, including with detransitioners, we've got it wrong?
I mean, it's really important when you're picking up on there in terms of the internalized homophobia. I've read studies recently suggesting that up to 70% of those with gender dysphoria who seek to transition end up also coming out as same-sex attracted. And actually, if people are choosing to transition because of shame or pressure around their sexuality, well, that in of itself feels like a type of conversion. In fact, what we're proposing, I would say, is the antithesis of conversion in many respects. In terms of also the pathway towards transitioning, you're completely right. We see younger and younger children commencing on puberty blockers. And again, studies show that once you start on puberty blockers, it's almost a given that you will then progress on to taking cross-sex hormones. Now, I'm not saying, and my colleagues are not saying, that this type of medication is never appropriate treatment, but actually we need to consider just how significant the risks can be. I mean, they can have irreversible, life-changing impacts, including, in some cases, things such as infertility. We've seen in recent weeks and months the well-founded, I would say, outrage against the Tavistock Clinic in terms of how they've operated.
That's the clinic I was talking about, yeah.
Yes, but exactly. In terms of the detransitioners, we've seen such a significant rise in those such as Kira Bell, and she's extremely brave in terms of standing up for this cause. But surely we require a pause for thought here, because many, in fact, most of these detransitioners that I've spoken to have said very strongly that in hindsight, they wish that the medical professionals, that the therapists had actually offered them an opportunity to explore and challenge their feelings rather than simply them towards transitioning.
Yes. Well, you say there that, I just want to pick you up on one point. You say there that there are some cases in which it would be appropriate to look at the pathways towards transitioning. In my eyes, and I'll probably be effectively cancelled for saying this, but in my eyes, it's never appropriate for someone under the age of 16 to get put on these pathways, which you've just argued there very eloquently, can be generally, or have problems presented later in life, if not immediately. And that strikes me as a very, very dangerous thing to do for an adolescent. You know, when I was that age, I was just discovering my sexuality and all the rest of it. And, you know, you're going through so much at that point. You are learning things about yourself every single day. Your character, those are your formative years. You can't make a decision like that, a decision that could harm your life going forward, surely.
Look, I think that's a fair point to raise, and particularly when we live in a world in which a young person only needs to perform a Google search and be transported into a world of social media and activist groups, unconditionally affirming transitioning as the way to live their lives. I've got some colleagues and in the therapy world who have said to me themselves that, and they're now in their late 20s, early 30s, and they were pretty upfront with me, and they said when they were younger, when they were growing up, they questioned their gender at times, and they said to me personally they feel very, very happy that the situation then wasn't as it is now, because they in all likelihood would have transitioned, and they think they would have regretted it for the rest of their lives. So I think we should draw a distinction between adults and children. And I think also, again, going back to the statistic I gave earlier around the fact that most children will settle into the biological sex. Look, gender dysphoria can be a very debilitating thing to go through, highly distressing, extremely confusing. Studies have shown that for some people, transitioning is the way to go. So as I said, myself and my colleagues are not saying never on this, but what we are saying is, particularly for young children, there needs to be a period of time in which therapy can be utilised towards exploring and investigating, being curious about these things, and also considering a range of options, as opposed to feeling that if I'm questioning my gender, the only thing I can do is transition.
To what extent, James, do you think that there's an element of, well, I feel this way, I want to feel better, this is the quick fix out of that, and then actually thinking, oh dear, what have I done? And this is because you're absolutely right. You'll scroll through social media, you'll watch a Netflix show, you'll turn on television and be presented with, trans outcomes and think, well, hang on, maybe this is for me, I'm going through an identity crisis, also known as adolescence, and think that this is the way out, this is the route out, I will feel better once I've done this. There are girls who used to be tomboys growing up who then go on to, never wear what would be stereotypical men's clothing again. Because that's part and parcel of adolescence. I'm just really concerned, actually, that I think, pandering to a group of very vocal activists, but a minority of activists, all the same, we are risking the futures of some of our most vulnerable people in society. That's just how I feel.
Well, look, silver bullets are always very appealing when it comes to things, you know, particularly things that really cause us to kind of confront our own existence. So I can see why the thought of a very kind of clear pathway towards transitioning and going through X, Y, and Z steps. I mean, I've come across many websites by campaign groups, and they read more as a roadmap towards transitioning than anything else. Look, I can see why that's appealing, you know, particularly if you really are having a bit of a crisis of faith in terms of who you are in the world. But actually, do we need to shift the focus towards acceptance of how we are? You know, for example, acceptance around the idea of, you know, gender atypical, because what we should be emphasizing, I think, to our young people in society is that stereotypes are stereotypes. And, you know, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being a more feminine boy or a more masculine girl. I think that's one angle to come at it. You know, there's an interesting quote that I like to use with my clients. It's around the paradox of acceptance. And it goes along the lines of, only when I accept things for how they truly are can real change take place. And I think that comes about so much, including in this arena. You know, can people accept themselves holistically in the world, not feeling like they need to change, you know, fundamental aspects of themselves, not feeling that they need to change their bodies? So again, this is where I think therapy can really come into play, offering up that exploration, that gentle curiosity, and seeing, is it possible for someone to become comfortable with who they are without needing to go down, as we said, what is a particularly, you know, life-changing, in many cases irreversible form of changing oneself?
Yeah, beautifully put. I mean, what I would say is that I think there needs to be a hell of a lot more of a focus on making life easier for those experiencing gender dysphoria as far as pathways to treatment are concerned. And by treatment, I mean therapy. I think we need to make that a hell of a lot easier. As it stands now, because of the pandemic, you're talking about 6 months waits for NHS treatment of your mental health. So that's one area where I would actually agree with I think, loud activists in this country, that actually we do need more of a focus on mental health in this country, so people can explore those things. But you're absolutely right, you don't achieve that by banning those pathways.
Exactly. You know, I couldn't agree more with that, actually. It is our duty as professionals to work in the best interests of our client, to do no harm, whether directly or indirectly. And if the government put through legislation which, for all intents and purposes, you know, prevents us from working with these clients with gender dysphoria, well, then we're simply unable to even, you know, follow our own internal ethical code on this. And I would fear for the outcomes for many young people if that were to happen. So this is why, as part of this petition, we are pleading with the government to engage with us and to safeguard beneficial explorative therapy, particularly for children suffering and struggling with gender dysphoria.
So I imagine many of my viewers watching this now, James, will be, one, I think, alarmed that this is taking place anyway, because I tend to find that people say, I can't believe this is happening in this country. How can people concerned about this actually get involved? Signing that petition, of course. Are there anything else? Are there other avenues that you think you would advocate people doing at this time?
Yes. Well, look, first and foremost, please do sign the petition, because we are keen to get to at least 10,000 signatories to ensure that we can get a formal response from the government. But we would love to get to 100,000 and get a debate in Parliament about this. It's too important not to have these important discussions on. You can also do things individually. You can write to your MP. You know, again, we're still not entirely sure what way government is going to go with this. There's still hopefully an opportunity to change the minds of those in power. So if you feel strongly about this, please do also write to your MP. And the final thing I would say, and I'd say this to anyone nowadays, is that, you know, your individual voice really does count. And so when you're having conversations with people, whether that be in person or whether that be online through social media, please do stand up for what you believe in. We really do believe actually that there's quite, in many cases, a silent majority of the public on our side. I know that for some people it's quite scary because they're worried about being accused of all sorts of horrific things and their reputation being damaged. And I fully appreciate that. But the truth of the matter is, until and unless people are able to speak up for what they believe in, things aren't going to change for the better.
Beautifully put. James, thank you so much for giving up your time today and talking to me. If people want to find you on social media, your Twitter handle is...
Yes, well, I only actually got Twitter for the first time yesterday, about 20 years too late. So you can simply find me at James Esses, and the group that I'm part of is called Thoughtful Therapists. You can also find us on Twitter.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. A link to that petition will be in the description. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.